and very happy to introduce him. Michael was one of my doctoral students years ago, a wonderful student, someone that you enjoy working with every day, someone that you never get tired of. And those of us who work with grad students in this room, you know that that's not always the case. Michael is just a pleasure to be around, and he's one of the hardest working scholars that I've ever met. Michael is always doing some form of research, whether it's in his side hustle in dinosaurs or in history. Michael's always doing something. And he wrote a wonderful dissertation on masculinity and the frontier and military mobilization around the American Revolution, looking at settlers in the Southwest in what is today Tennessee, and why the Over Mountain men got involved in the American Revolutionary War, and found that honor had a lot to do with that. After he got his PhD here at the University of Tennessee, he got a job, which is awesome. And we celebrate Michael for that, especially nowadays when jobs in history are rare. And we're so happy and proud of Michael. He's a director of the Lincoln Memorial University Library and Museum for Abraham Lincoln, which is another topic, probably for another conference, another symposium. Michael has a wealth of knowledge about Lincoln and the Civil War, in addition to the American Revolutionary War. But we're pleased to have him back. I'm so happy to have him back on campus and to be able to introduce my friend and my former student, Dr. Michael Lynch, who will be talking to us today about innocence and Indian warfare in the Declaration's rhetoric. Michael, welcome back.
Thank you. As somebody who prefers early American history and trained in early American history, but ended up at an Abraham Lincoln site, it's nice to be talking about something besides Lincoln today. Or as they call the American Revolution, my colleagues in public history and the National Park Service call the Revolution that other war. So it's really nice to be here. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, read one of the accusations Congress leveled at George III in the Declaration of Independence, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. This reference to slave rebellion and Indian war in the Revolution's most prominent public statement should surprise no one familiar with modern studies of the era's political rhetoric. As Robert G. Parkinson has demonstrated, invocations of British-instigated atrocities committed by enslaved people and Native Americans were critical to revolutionary efforts to rally white readers behind a common cause. Peter Silver, meanwhile, has shown that fear of Indian attacks catalyzed the emergence of a shared racial identity among whites in the 18th century. What perhaps merits additional attention is the Declaration's description of the character of Indian attacks. Undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. When contemplating the prospect of Indian war, what horrified revolutionary Americans was not only the identity of their adversaries, but the composition of the victims. Drawing on early modern notions of just war, revolutionaries considered violence against women, children, and the elderly particularly heinous and unmanly. They believed such violence characterized Native American war, consistently highlighting the plight of these innocents in their accounts of Indian attacks. They invoked these vulnerable victims to denounce the British war effort as barbarous and illegitimate, even though colonists themselves had long employed a form of undistinguished destruction when campaigning in Indian country. Early modern European jurists and political philosophers singled out women, children, and the aged as inappropriate subjects of military violence. Citing examples from antiquity, Hugo Grotius exempted women, children, and old men as legitimate military targets in the 17th century. Likewise, Vattel wrote that women, children, the sick, and the aged were enemies who make no resistance and consequently give us no right to treat their persons ill or use any violence against them, much less to take away their lives. Vattel called this so plain a maxim of justice and humanity that at present every nation in the least civilized acquiesces in it. What of the Declaration's statement that a failure to abide by these norms was the known rule of warfare among Native Americans? In some important respects, the claim was not true. Sexual violence against women, which was condemned as especially worthy of punishment by Grotius, at least among Christian nations, was quite rare in Indian warfare during the 18th century in eastern North America, partly due to beliefs about ritual abstention from intimate contact of any kind between men and women when men were going to war. Young and female prisoners were also less likely than adult men to be subject to ritualized torture and killing. But conflicts between Indian nations and early American colonists did see non-combatants of various ages, sexes, and physical conditions fall victim to capture, violence, and death. Dispersed backcountry homesteads offered tempting targets to Native Americans engaged in raids aimed at inflicting damage and obtaining captives with minimal casualties to the attacking party. And returning warriors sometimes killed those prisoners who were most liable to slow them down, which obviously jeopardized the very old, the very young, and the very weak. These associations between Indian warfare and violence against women and children, and dread for those innocents in the path of British-instigated attacks, appeared in American commentary about the conflict with Britain from its very outset. The Indians are known to conduct their wars so entirely without faith in humanity, John Adams declared in June 1775, that it would bring eternal infamy on the ministry throughout all Europe if they should excite these savages to war. To let loose these bloodhounds, to scalp men and to butcher women and children is horrid. Still, it is such kind of humanity and policy as we have experienced from the ministry. The following month, and remember this is just a few months after the war breaks out, Congress's address to the people of Ireland claimed that wild and barbarous savages of the wilderness had been instigated to deluge our settlements with the blood of innocent and defenseless women and children. Benjamin Franklin expressed horror at the notion of British authorities hiring the Indian savages to assassinate our planters in the back settlements. They are the poorest and most innocent of all people. This is not long after he had said they were the worst sort of people after killing a group of peaceful Indians. And the Indian manner is to murder and scalp men, women, and children. Canada's governor, he asserted, had already been very industrious in engaging the Indians to begin their horrid work. This is making war like nations who never had been friends and never wished to be such while the world stands. A few months later, Franklin composed a list of British outrages which included exciting the savages to fall upon our innocent outsettlers, farmers who have no concern in and from their situation can scarce have any knowledge of this dispute, especially when it is considered that the Indian manner of making war is by surprising families in the night and killing all without distinction of age or sex. He asked a correspondent what would be thought of it if the Congress should hire an Italian bravo to break into the house of one of your ministers and murder him in his bed. So strongly did early modern commentators in America identify wholesale violence against civilians with Indian fighting that when British regulars engaged in the indiscriminate destruction of towns, patriots invoked Native American examples to denounce them. John Adams condemned the burning of Charlestown, Massachusetts as a method of conducting war long since become disreputable among civilized nations. But every year brings us fresh evidence that we have nothing to hope for from our loving mother country, but cruelties more abominable than those which are practiced by the savage Indians. Franklin, too, compared the destruction of Charlestown to Indian warfare, claiming that some sick, aged, and decrepit poor persons who could not be carried off in time perished in the flames. In all our wars, from our first settlement in America to the present time, we never received so much damage from the Indian savages as in this one day from these. Franklin's reference to violated houses and slaughtered families reflects an important feature of revolutionary rhetoric about Indian war. Contemporary commentators saw victims of indiscriminate Indian violence as not just innocent women and children, but someone's women and children. That is, household dependents and members of patriarchal families. Consider, for example, a tabulation of victims from the combined Indian-Tory assault on Cherry Valley in November of 1778 sent to New York Governor George Clinton. The first column listed the names of the heads of families and how many killed of each family, with entries reading Mr. Dunlap, his wife, Mr. Moore, his wife and daughters, Mr. McCland, himself and children, Mr. Campbell, his son, and so on. Another column for prisoners remaining in enemy hands likewise identified victims by the households to which they belonged, whether as children or enslaved persons. And additional columns listed the number of homes, barns, and other outbuildings burned per household unit. Backwoods commanders were especially likely to identify victims of Indian attacks by referring to the male-headed household to which they belonged. A report from Fort Pitt, for example, stated that Indians had killed and scalped one Benjamin Spear, his wife, and 6 children on Dunkard Creek. Arthur Campbell, a militia officer from Western Virginia, likewise reported one John Henry was dangerously wounded upon Clinch about 4 miles from Captain Smith's station, and it is supposed his wife and 3 small children is taken prisoners. In 1782, Campbell again referred to an Indian attack as an assault on a male-headed household. By a few lines received last night from Major Dysart, I'm informed that the Indians have murdered Halbert McClure's family near our courthouse and some other persons. When conflict with Indians broke out, the security of these vulnerable dependents was an immediate subject of concern for backwoods officers. A correspondent warned Colonel William Preston of southwestern Virginia to take care when Shawnees took up arms in 1774, since you have a great number under your care whose dependence for protection under God is upon you, a loving wife, and a number of helpless children. On the outbreak of war with the Cherokees 2 years later, another Virginia officer wrote, I'm very uneasy on account of my mother and sister. I hope the old woman will be prevailed upon to retire to some place of safety. All the women and children in the country ought to be removed out of the reach of the enemy as soon as it can possibly be done, that the men may be altogether employed in repelling and pursuing the enemy. As Preston informed Patrick Henry in 1778, men who failed to evacuate their farms when Indian wars broke out took a terrible risk, since they and their helpless families must fall a sacrifice to savage fury and revenge. British commanders and officials were well aware of the risk to these dependents in employing Indians in a military capacity. But even when imperial functionaries attempted to limit violence against women and children, or to stop warriors from going to war altogether, patriot commentators still accuse them of orchestrating the murder of household innocents. As Overhill Cherokee warriors set out to attack the squatters in the Tennessee country in 1776, Henry Stewart, acting as deputy for his brother John Stewart, the superintendent for Indian Affairs in the South, warned them not to provoke the Americans' wrath by acting indiscriminately to kill women and children and to attack the king's friends as well as his enemies. And yet a member of North Carolina's Council of Safety blamed the destruction of upwards of 200 men, women, and children on the wicked and diabolical British Cherokee agent. As this matter is perfectly ministerial, he wrote, I hope a Tory will never after this open his mouth in favor of the British government, which of all governments on earth, I believe at this time is the most tyrannical and bloody. General Charles Lee, commander of American forces in the South when these attacks occurred, likewise believed they were a part of a coordinated royal plan to mix men, women, and children in one common carnage by the hands of Indians. And indeed, some observers thought British involvement had actually amplified the warriors' violence, One Southwest Virginia settler believed the Indians' barbarous disposition would be rendered more so than usual by those wretches who have instigated them to this cruelty. Similarly, when Governor Henry Hamilton met with Indians in council at Detroit, he exhorted them to remember they were men and were desired to make war against men and not against women or children, and to forbear to dip their hands in the blood of the two latter. Nevertheless, when Hamilton fell into the hands of Virginia forces, Thomas Jefferson charged that the indiscriminate murder of men, women, and children with the usual circumstances of barbarity practiced by the Indian savages was the particular task of Governor Hamilton's employment. The Virginia Council justified Hamilton's close confinement in irons by noting his incitement of the Indians to perpetrate their accustomed cruelties on the citizens of these states without distinction of age, sex, or condition, and ordered similar treatment of an officer who went out from time to time under general orders to spare neither men, women, nor children. Given the horror with which Americans reacted to the idea of women in the hands of British allied Indians, it is not surprising that what Robert Parkinson calls the most extensive and most orchestrated campaign the Patriots had yet undertaken to propagate the common cause focused on the death of a young woman. Mere days after Indians attached to General John Burgoyne's army killed Jane McCrae, the fiancée of a Loyalist officer, in the summer of 1777, accounts began appearing in papers across New York, Pennsylvania, and New England, and eventually stretched all the way to South Carolina. The tendency to identify dependent victims of Indian violence by their family and household ties made McCrae an especially ideal illustration of the undistinguished destruction Americans attributed to Indians on the warpath. After all, she was simultaneously a female, the intended wife of a Tory, and, as Benedict Arnold stated, a young lady of family. But neither her sex, nor her betrothal to a Loyalist, nor her respectable family connections had protected her. Depictions of butchered family dependents had become a standard motif in anti-Indian literature, what Peter Silver terms the anti-Indian sublime, and art before the Revolution, and it was one patriot propagandist readily adapted to the cause of independence. When preparing a list of 26 prints to illustrate Britain's repertoire of atrocities in the war, Franklin suggested 10 images. So this is 10 out of 26 images in the list that included depictions of violated women, beleaguered families, Native Americans, or a combination of all three. Savages killing and scalping the frontier farmers and their families, women and children. English officers mixed with the savages and giving them orders and encouraging them, read one entry. Governor Tonin sitting in state, a table before him, read the next. His soldiers and savages bringing in scalps of the Georgia people and presenting them. Money on the table with which he pays for them. Alongside these illustrations of Indian conduct, Franklin proposed depictions of innocents suffering similar outrages at the hands of British troops. Women with children in their arms in the midst of a town aflame, or British officers plundering with their own hands farmhouses, abusing the old people of the house, insulting the young landlady, and frightening the children. But there was an ironic dimension to these denunciations of indiscriminate violence. It was precisely when Euro-Americans campaigned against Indians that they themselves were most likely to inflict wholesale suffering on entire communities. The burning of towns, the destruction of food sources, and the displacement of populations had characterized punitive marches into Indian country a century before the Revolution. And patriots adopted these measures as readily as they incorporated literary motifs of scalped women and butchered children from colonial propaganda into anti-British accounts. General John Sullivan's 1779 expedition into Iroquois territory was only the most notable and well-documented example. The same summer that Jefferson penned Congress's justification for independence, he made plain his sentiments about the recent Cherokee attacks on the margins of Virginia and the Carolinas and here in present-day East Tennessee. I hope the Cherokees will now be driven beyond the Mississippi and that in the future, and that this in the future will be declared to the Indians the invariable consequence of their beginning a war. So this is 60 years before the Indian removal policy actually went into effect. He was hardly the only revolutionary who supported indiscriminate action against Native American tribes. In response to Indian and Tory raids, one outraged correspondent told Abigail Adams that the enemies of America must be eradicated root and branch as soon as ever we get a little relaxation from war on the seacoasts. Another writer agreed. Detachments have been ordered up to check not only their incursions, but to sack their towns and extirpate those bloodhounds from the earth. We must deal with them in their own way. Promiscuous destruction is their rule and mode of warfare. This talk of eradication and extirpation and promiscuous destruction seemed to leave little room for the distinctions of age, sex, and condition that writers like Grotius had called for. Some revolutionaries did attempt to observe these distinctions when fighting Indians, or at least give voice to them. The North Carolina Council of Safety instructed General Griffith Rutherford to restrain the soldiery from destroying the women and children in his retaliatory campaign against the Cherokees, which followed those 1776 attacks. The same state's delegates to Congress tempered the fiery apocalyptic language of eradication with the need to distinguish enemies by age and sex. The gross infernal breach of faith which they have been guilty of shuts them out from every pretension to mercy, they wrote. To extinguish the very race of them, and scarce to leave enough of existence to be a vestige in proof that a Cherokee nation once was, would perhaps be no more than the blood of our slaughtered countrymen might call for. But Christianity, the dear religion of peace and mercy, should hold our conquering hands. And while we feel the resentment of men, we ought not to forget the duties of the Christian. Women and children are not a conquest worthy the American arms. Virginia's council likewise directed the commander of a 1777 expedition to show mercy to the women and children and to such of the men as surrender themselves. In practice, of course, the destruction of towns and crops deprived not only warriors, but Native women and children alike of shelter and food. And if many American commentators balked at inflicting direct physical violence on the bodies of young and female Indians, those bodies remained fit subjects for captivity. Indeed, when outlining a plan for an expedition into Indian country in 1779, George Washington expressed his hope that the enemy might neglect in some places to remove the old men, women, and children, and that these will fall into our hands. Yet even practitioners of these punitive campaigns, which were explicitly intended to punish and cow American enemies, felt compelled to try and frame their actions in terms early modern theorists would have approved. So to illustrate this, we'll take another example here from East Tennessee. After leading mountain militia in just such a campaign against the Cherokees, Revolutionary officer and future Tennessee governor, Colonel John Sevier, said this to his recent foes during a peace conference. I'm not afraid to fight with men, but I never hurt women and children. They are innocent, harmless beings. It is true I took some of them prisoners, but it was only with a view to exchange for our people you have as prisoners. I have used them well, kept them at my own house, and treated them as my own children. And you shall have them every one as soon as you bring in our people. If Sevier's remarks belied the harsh realities of interracial and intercultural conflict in the Revolution, they also revealed the pervasiveness and power of contemporary ideas about the proper limits of war. Well, thank you very much for your attention. I think we're doing some questions. So